Imagine the River Seine. Not the sparkling waterway of tourists and lovers, but a dark artery choked with terror. Imagine hundreds upon hundreds of sleek, menacing longships, dragon heads carved into their prows, slicing through the water towards the heart of West Francia. The year is 885. The Vikings have returned to Paris. And this time, they bring an army unlike any seen before. This wasn't their first visit. 40 years earlier, in 845, Ragnar Lothbrok's forces had sacked the city, leaving only after King Charles the Bald paid a humiliating ransom, 7,000 pounds of silver. The Frankish kingdom, fractured by internal strife and weak leadership, seemed like easy prey. Vulnerable. Ripe for the taking. But something had changed since that last devastating raid. The Franks, learning from bitter experience, had fortified Paris. In 864, 2 strategic wooden bridges were constructed across the Seine, deliberately positioned to control river traffic. One spanned from the Isle de la Cite, the island heart of Paris, to the north bank, the other to the south. These weren't just river crossings, they were choke points, defensive bastions built to halt the Viking tide. Nobody knew it then, but these humble wooden structures would soon become the stage for an epic struggle of survival. November 885. The dreaded sails appear on the horizon. A fleet estimated at over 300 ships, carrying perhaps 30,000 warriors, a number possibly inflated by terrified chroniclers, but undeniably immense. At their head, a figure already carving his name into legend. Rollo. A Norse chieftain of formidable reputation, destined for an even greater, unexpected future. Their demand was simple, brutal, and familiar. Passage up the Seine to raid the fertile lands of Burgundy further inland, and, of course, tribute. Gold and silver to appease their hunger. But standing against them was Odo, Count of Paris. A man of courage and local authority, embodying the rising power of regional lords in a kingdom where the central monarchy was failing. Odo had perhaps only a few hundred fighting men within the city walls. Hundreds against tens of thousands. The odds were impossible. Suicidal. Rollo likely expected a swift capitulation, another easy payment like in 845. But Odo refused. Flatly. Absolutely. Paris would not yield passage. Paris would not pay. The bridges would hold. The city would fight. The siege began. The Vikings unleashed their fury. They battered the gates with rams, showered the walls with arrows, attempted to scale the ramparts with ladders. They set fires, hoping to burn down the wooden defenses. They even tried mining beneath the walls. But the Parisians, led by Odo and Bishop Goslin, fought with the ferocity of the desperate. From the walls, they poured boiling oil, hot pitch, and scalding wax onto the attackers below. Archers rained down death. The key battle raged around the northern bridge, the gateway to the city proper. Time and again, the Vikings assaulted the bridge tower, and time and again, they were repulsed in bloody chaos. The Seine ran red. The defense was heroic, stubborn, unbelievable. The wooden bridge, guarded by a mere handful of determined Franks, became a symbol of unyielding defiance against overwhelming force. Weeks turned into months. The initial Viking confidence waned. Unable to storm the city, they settled in for a long siege. They built a fortified camp on the right bank of the Seine, downstream from the city, effectively blockading Paris. From this base, they ravaged the surrounding countryside, but the city itself remained inviolate, an island fortress holding firm. Inside Paris, however, the situation grew dire. Food supplies dwindled. Hunger gnawed at the defenders and the populace. Disease began to spread through the crowded confines of the Isle de la Cite. Bishop Goslin, a pillar of the defense, succumbed to illness. Yet, they held on. Through the brutal winter and into the spring and summer of 886, the thin line of defenders refused to break. Their hope rested on one thing: the arrival of the Emperor, Charles the Fat, king of West Francia and ruler of the vast Carolingian Empire. Surely, he would come with the imperial army and crush the invaders. Finally, in October 886, after nearly a year of suffering and defiance, lookouts spotted the banners of the imperial host approaching. A massive Frankish army, led by the emperor himself, arrived on the hills overlooking Paris. Relief surged through the exhausted city. Salvation was at hand. The nightmare was ending. Or was it? Emperor Charles the Fat surveyed the situation. He saw the weary Vikings, still formidable but undoubtedly battered by the long siege. He saw the resilient city, starved but unbroken. He had the numbers, the advantage. A decisive battle could annihilate the Viking threat on the Seine. But Charles chose differently. Instead of ordering an attack, he entered into negotiations with Rollo. The Parisians watched in disbelief as their emperor, the man who was supposed to save them, struck a deal with the enemy who had besieged them for a year. The terms were shocking, almost unbelievable. Charles granted Rollo the permission he had originally sought. Free passage up the Seine to raid Burgundy, a region currently in revolt against the emperor's authority. Effectively, Charles was sicking the Vikings on his own rebellious subjects. And worse, he agreed to pay the Vikings a ransom. 700 pounds of silver, to be delivered the following spring. He paid the besiegers after his own subjects had bravely resisted them for almost a year. The Frankish army, which had arrived to liberate Paris, instead stood by and watched as the Viking fleet sailed past the city, deeper into the heartland of Francia, to plunder Burgundy with the emperor's blessing. The consequences of this decision were seismic. For Odo, the siege was a triumph. His bravery and leadership turned him into a national hero. The man who held Paris against impossible odds became the embodiment of Frankish resistance. When Charles the Fat was deposed just a year later, largely due to the perceived shame of his actions at Paris, it was Odo whom the nobles elected as the new king of West Francia in 888. The siege marked a decisive shift in power from the weakening Carolingian dynasty to strong, local figures like Odo. For Charles the Fat, the siege was the final nail in the coffin of his reign and reputation. His failure to fight, his willingness to pay off the enemy and redirect them onto his own lands, shattered his authority. He was seen as weak, cowardly, and ineffective. His empire soon crumbled. For the Vikings, the siege was a harsh lesson. While they eventually got paid and gained passage, the immense effort and time invested in trying to take a well-defended city like Paris proved costly. It demonstrated that outright conquest of fortified centers was becoming increasingly difficult. This experience likely contributed to a strategic shift among some Viking groups, including Rollos. Instead of purely seasonal raiding, permanent settlement and integration became a more viable path. Indeed, just a few decades later, in 911, this same Rollo would be granted the lands that would become Normandy by another Frankish king, Charles the Simple, becoming a vassal, converting to Christianity, and founding a dynasty that would change European history forever. The Great Siege of Paris in 885–886 was more than just a battle, it was a turning point. It showcased incredible resilience, exposed fatal weakness at the highest level, reshaped the political landscape of Francia, and subtly altered the course of the Viking Age itself. A story of defiance, betrayal, and the unexpected currents that shape history, hidden beneath the stones of Paris and carried on the waters of the Seine.